Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Gabriel Jaja, producer. Along with more than 500,000 American deaths, lockdowns, and federal mandates, the COVID-19 pandemic brought with it unprecedented government spending and economic disruption. In this episode, Acton Institute's research fellows, Dan Hugger and Dylan Pahman, evaluate the economic and moral implications of the COVID relief bill. They discuss the true purpose of a stimulus package, the Biden administration's COVID relief bill itself, and its effects on the future economy, how the American people should react morally, and if stimulus checks could have been rolled out in a more effective way. You can find additional resources in the show notes of this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. If you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen.
Welcome. This is Dan Hugger, Librarian and Research Associate of the Acton Institute, and today I am joined by
Dylan Pahman, Executive Editor of the Journal of Markets and Morality and a Research Fellow here at Acton.
Dylan. There is a new sort of bipartisan consensus that we need stimulus and we need lots of it. We're going to talk a little bit about sort of what is stimulus, what has been sort of a lot of the underlying concerns, what are sort of the moral implications of some of this stuff, and Yeah,
I think we should start just with the basics. Let's talk about, when people talk about COVID stimulus or, these stimulus checks, what in particular are we referring to? Is it just the checks people are getting in the mail or direct deposit, or is there more to it than that?
So this has been a series of bills, and President Joe Biden has recently proposed a $1.8 trillion economic stimulus in the form of what he's calling the American Families Plan. And this represents kind of an extension of the unprecedented wave of government spending and proposed spending, which began last year in March under then President Trump, with the CARES Act, which was $2.2 trillion. And then it continued in this March with the American Rescue Plan, which was $1.9 trillion. And then there's a proposed American Jobs Plan at $2.2 trillion. And the grand total of all this spending and proposed spending represents basically a third of the size of the entire economy of the United States. So those are sort of the legislative pieces. They've got a lot of parts to them, and they're all being referred to as stimulus.
Right.
And John Maynard Keynes was an early 20th century economist. And
was founder of macroeconomics. Right?
Yeah, modern macroeconomics. And a lot of his thinking is the root of this sort of idea for a stimulus proposal. And you got to think stimulus. It's kind of, a stimulus is supposed to provoke a response. Mm-hmm. And this is a government stimulus. This is government spending designed to provoke a response in the private sector through either, fiscal or monetary policy. And the idea is that it's necessary to raise aggregate demand for all the goods and services that are around, that in a recession, there's a danger that the economy won't self-correct. This is Keynes's theory. Bracket off how useful that actually is.
Sure.
But, this is sort of the argument that's made.
So people got to have money to spend in order for businesses to make money, to then provide them with jobs. And when you're looking at something like Keynes did of the Great Depression, they were scrambling for ways to figure out how to get people employed again.
Yeah.
Right? And
they're looking at, there's staggering unemployment, there's decreased productivity, and there's just patterns of lower growth that they're thinking, if we don't inject something into this, it's not gonna. There's a chance that this persists and continues to spiral downward.
Yeah, Keynes' famous quote, he was criticizing those who said, well, in the long run, this is all going to correct itself, right? There's certain principles, the way economies work. And he said, well, that may be true, but in the long run, we're all dead. Yeah. And he meant this, and I think there are many legitimate reasons to disagree with his overall theory, but his point was that there's a moral obligation to help people when they're suffering now. And he thought this was a way to do that.
And this is the logic more recently of sort of the Economic Stimulus Act of 2008, which was, a mere $152 billion. Or the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008, also a mere $700 billion. And then the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009, which is, $831 billion.
So once again, bipartisan measures as well for starting in the Bush administration. And then continued in the Obama administration.
Yep, continuing the Obama administration. And the idea there was sort of in line with what Keynes was thinking. We had an economic contraction. We had, there was fears of another sort of Great Depression that Keynes was dealing with in his lifetime. And that's a little different than where we're dealing today.
How is it different?
We've got economic growth. Like the International Monetary Fund currently projects economic growth in the United States to be 5.1% in 2021 and 2.5% in 2022. We've got a labor shortage. We've got soaring commodity prices. And there's a bull market in stocks. This doesn't seem to fit the criteria.
Yeah. Now my understanding is Keynes also recommended that people do the opposite in times of high growth, right? So if anything, a strict Keynesian perspective would say, well, now is the time to take a step back.
Yep.
And that is not happening.
Yeah. So there was a lot of economic dislocation, disruption. There was unemployment, is still up, although less up than it was. We're recovering there now as a result of the pandemic. And partially as a result of the pandemic, partially as a result of government responses to the pandemic, mandatory closures.
Yeah, a lot of businesses couldn't have been open if they wanted to.
Yeah, a lot of regulation. So partially government caused, partially pandemic caused, short-term economic disruption. But we're out of the way there, or at least the economy in aggregate is. Now, many people aren't. Many people are still unemployed. Many people are still struggling. So one of the other ways that these have been pitched is that these are relief programs. What are some of the elements here that have been targeted towards individuals or businesses as a sort of relief measure for the economic disruption caused by the pandemic and by government policy in response to the pandemic?
Yeah. So there's been loans for businesses. There's been stimulus for business as well, and then there's been checks or deposits to individuals. So this was at least for some people, a very big reason to vote in support for President Biden, because the Trump administration had managed to push through or at least approve a $600 stimulus to anyone who qualified based on their tax returns.
Second round.
It was a second round, I should say. That was not the first time, but it was the second round. It was
not the first issuance of Trump bucks.
Right. But there were a lot of people who said, no, we need 2,000, not 600. And so they pushed for that, and Biden said, you'll get it, and then kind of walked it back and said, well, 2,000 minus 600 is 1,400, and so that's what you're going to get. And some people were upset even about that. But so it's been interesting. One constant, I think, is that people like free money. And now, as you said, a lot of people are hurting, and I absolutely agree. A lot of people needed help, and this is a way to potentially help them. But I know that it's also far more complicated than that. So, you looked into some of the details of these various bills. The names of these things, and this is true of any government proposal, are always extremely deceptive, right? Like the CARES Act. So if you're against it, you don't care, right? Or the American Jobs Act. Don't you think Americans should have jobs? So
American Families Plan.
Families, yeah. Aren't you pro-family? So let's get into the details and poke around a little bit more because the labels are often quite deceptive. I think that doesn't mean that there's never anything there that might correspond, but there's usually a lot more than people realize.
Well, one of the things we talked about, one of the things that has been in these bills is extended, amplified, juiced up unemployment benefits. And this is something that I think is very much related to our current labor shortage. There are a lot of people right now who would lose those benefits if they got a job. And, people respond to incentives. And if someone is getting their unemployment benefits, is, let's say, able to care for children as a result, if someone is if they were to re-enter the labor market, maybe they would just make just as much. Maybe they would make less because these are very much beefed up unemployment benefits. So you got a lot of people who just are not participating in the labor force as a consequence of this, as many states around the country have reopened. Many people are looking to hire workers.
Yeah, so this is interesting because, for a variety of reasons. From an economic perspective, then I don't really like the way economists use this term, but you could say this is very rational unemployment to the extent that it's related to these stimulus bills and expansion of benefits, and that if people have a better alternative, why wouldn't they spend more time with their kids? Or why wouldn't they, keep working on their house or whatever the case may be until they have to go out into the labor force again? Also interesting is that this seems now to be almost a complete inversion of Keynes' original conception of a stimulus. His whole point was we want to reduce unemployment, and you're suggesting at least that it's a contributing factor to continuing it and growing the unemployment rate.
One of the other interesting consequences, I think, of these is those loans extended to businesses. And there's a condition on these loans that they're spent, a certain percentage of this is spent on payroll. And if it's spent on payroll, keeping people employed, then those loans are forgiven. This is something that I've heard with talking to local businessmen that have utilized this to lock up talent, particularly if you're in an industry that has skilled labor. Even if you don't have the work right now, even if because of the COVID disruptions, you're not able to sort of operate your business at normal capacity, it's still costly to go out and find talent. And if somebody's willing to pay you to keep that talent, even if that talent is idle in your industry or underutilized, that happens. And that affects general productivity because these are people with skills that perhaps could have been hired by other firms that are now sort of, the government is subsidizing firms keeping talent. So that causes like another strange sort of dislocation in the labor market. One of the other things we talked about are these individual payments, these individual checks. What are the consequences of just injecting a lot of money into an economy?
There's a lot, right? You're going to, a lot of the worries in my very nerdy circles are in terms of inflation, right? If you're just effectively, not actually printing money, but effectively you're increasing the money supply, increasing spending power, it tends to get offset as prices reflect the increased spending power of people. So the people get money, they now have more buying power, but now prices start to rise, and so they can buy less. And so these sorts of things often, if there's no increase of productivity going along with it, don't actually increase wealth or well-being. Another concern that I have about this, and this applies to a lot of policies, is that these stimulus programs and bills are federal programs. And now there is some means testing in terms of they base it on people's tax returns and that sort of thing.
Yeah, the monopoly man is not getting a check.
Right. It's so far as we know. And maybe maybe there's an earmark in there somewhere. And also people with children received extra as well. So there is some attention to particular need. Nevertheless, the amounts given does not vary based on cost of living. So if you live in New York City and you got that $1,400, that might not even cover 1 month's rent in a very small apartment. Whereas here in Grand Rapids, Michigan, that might cover 2 months' rent.
Yeah.
Or let's say that you have roommates. You're like a 20-something college student, something like that. Well, that could be like 3 or 4 months' rent. Or look at like a small town with even better cost of living than Grand Rapids. So the just unintentionally, when you just give people money like that, this is one of the problems I have with universal basic income, even with minimum wages, which doesn't give people money, but it sets a federal rate for all wages everywhere, is it's not actually paying any attention to need. And so it completely exists outside of the basic demands of justice, which is to render each what is due. And part of that is a person's need in their situation. And so there's cost to that. I'm not saying that necessarily the best alternative would be that, we hire 1 million government workers to investigate everybody's particular situation, figure it out. I get that there's complications. There's reasons why you have to simplify to execute something like this. But it is interesting to ask and to think about that the people in the most dense urban areas, which, as far as I can tell, were also the most affected by COVID-19, are the people who effectively are getting the least amount of relief from any of these stimulus bills just because of the cost of living differences. And so that's like there's a whole distribution side to this that I think just gets lost in the Twitter storm discussion that we have about these sorts of things, and certainly lost in the grand labels placed on these bills that, we're helping American families. Well, maybe you're helping American families in like Iowa, but you are helping an American family in New York City 4 times less with the same exact measure.
And the economic dislocation has been different in different parts of the country.
Mm-hmm.
Different parts of the country have had different restrictions. Different industries have been affected in greater or larger numbers throughout the country. So that's another point at which that subsidiarity principle
right.
would best be taken under advisement.
The most local level of government or even local organizations and institutions are best equipped to deal with local needs. Now, when they find themselves insufficient to deal with the need, the same principle says, well, a higher level of institution has some responsibility to step in and help. And I think that's maybe, to be charitable, the best justification I can think of for any of this is that for example, on the state level, I know people in Michigan who had periods of unemployment last year due to the pandemic, and it took 8 months before they received any unemployment. Now, it was all backdated. They got a ton when they finally got it, but if they needed something in the meantime, they weren't getting it from the state of Michigan. They had issues with their claim. They had to appeal, all that sort of stuff. And the system was just way overloaded with the number of applications. And so, there's at least a question there. Now, I think there's a lot of problems and a lot of other, a lot of issues involved, but that's, just taking things as they are. It's a question there to say, well, does the federal government have any responsibility to step in and help its citizens in those circumstances? A case can at least be made. There's all the details make things very complicated, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a little bit about how this isn't in any sense a stimulus, according to Hoyle rules of stimulus set by macroeconomics. We've talked about how this is, in a sense, relief. It's had some unintended consequences. It's had some bad consequences. But you've pointed out, there were local government failures. Mm-hmm. There was large economic disruption caused. One of the other things that are in these bills are what I could call like national economic planning sort of things, infrastructure bills. And what is considered infrastructure is very broad. You have politicians tweeting out,
right,
childcare is infrastructure. You have people encouraging, anything under the sun is infrastructure. Paying teachers to teach Zoom classes is infrastructure, and all of this. But there is a very notion that, like, the Biden administration has taken this opportunity to sort of try to restructure the American economy in ways that it believes we should go in terms of maintaining international competitiveness, in terms of transitioning away from fossil fuels, in terms of education reform. All of these sort of things are sort of built in, and the idea of like this is an opportunity for us to sort of fundamentally restructure some of the American economy as all this dislocation is taking place.
I know you found a good quote from Biden, or at least it was a reporter's account from Biden after an international summit, something along those lines, where he referenced the Chinese economy and the planning done there.
Yes, this was from a story. Nell Ferguson over at the Hoover Institution quoted Joe Biden in March saying when he was discussing with Prime Minister Boris Johnson sort of a Western version of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which was sort of an economic development initiative. And President Biden said that I suggest we should have essentially a similar initiative pulling from the democratic states, helping those communities around the world that in fact need help. So this is the Chinese model of development. The Chinese model of development is to leverage high amounts of government debt to invest in building up local industry, to basically, try to engineer a competitive an economy that's a world power.
Well, now isn't that how China's been on the rise in the last few decades?
Well, this is the debate. So there are two things that have happened in China over the last 30 years. One is there was a market period beginning sort of late 80s, early 90s of market-based reforms where all of a sudden, a Maoist China was a totally command and control economy, and restrictions on business and trade, those were relaxed. Sort of economic development zones were outlined. You had explosive growth in some of these
free
cities.
trade zones.
Yep. People allowing to keep and save wages. Those things that we take for granted as in a developed Western country came, at least in some form, to many parts of China. And this is what I would submit was the catalyst for economic growth. What we've seen with Xi Jinping is the introduction of a different sort of model where, you have former finance minister in China, Liu Zhuai, thinks the situation is, quote, extremely severe with risks and challenges because of all of this deficit-financed growth. And that's essentially what we're doing today. I mean, there hasn't been a commiserate rise in taxes. We weren't running net positive revenues before any of this. But the idea is to sort of leverage this debt into a sort of national economic planning that hopefully leads to growth. What are some of the problems with that approach?
There's a lot of problems with that approach. Again, we covered some of the possible justifications, possible good side of these bills, but as you've mentioned, they are just stuffed full of a lot of things that have nothing to do with the average American family getting a check. And these sorts of things are problematic. They're problematic in terms of the debt and the deficit. Somebody has to pay that eventually. One of my favorite Saturday Night Live skits has Steve Martin. He was like the host at the time, and it's him and I believe Amy Poehler is his wife, and then Chris Parnell is the author of a self-help book and is like 1 page long, and all it says is, don't buy things you can't afford, right? And the whole skit is Steve Martin saying, but what if I want it, right? And they're just trying to come up with reasons. How do we get out of our financial, how do we pay off all this credit card debt? How do we get into this? And then he just shows up and he says, well, maybe you shouldn't take out so much debt, and they just try to find every other answer they possibly can. And that's the kind of comical way to look at it. And governments are different than individuals. It's not that debt per se is always bad. But at a certain point, the mere interest payments on this debt are massive, not to mention actually paying it down. To the point where we're passing this on. Every debt that a government has is future taxes, or at least future tax revenue. That's how the government gets money. I guess occasionally people pay to like visit a public park or something like that. It's not, but hopefully that's going back to the parks. Who knows? But for the most part, it's through taxes. So this is our children's tax revenue or our grandchildren's tax revenue. We are spending it for them before they've even made a single dollar. There's all kinds of intergenerational responsibility that should go along with that. And we should think very hard about whether it's worth it every time we do it. Doesn't mean we never should, but we should probably be a bit more cautious than we currently are being. And I think, in the midst of a national crisis, perhaps even widespread communal trauma over, a very tragic year, over more than a year now, of a pandemic and the loss of 500,000 Americans in 2020 alone. I think people are just ready for anything that could make them feel better. And unfortunately, people are capitalizing on that politically. So I think in those terms, I guess that's a bit more of a moral, spiritual take than an economic one, although I do think there are, economic underpinnings to it. But that's my major concerns. You have a lot of desperate people who are very willing to agree to this because everybody just wants some relief, right? Like in like a psychological sense. Like we're sick of, people have been anxious and depressed for a year, and somebody comes along and says, well, we can help. People aren't really that disposed to look into the details at that point. They just say, well, I want to support the people that want to help and not support the people that don't want to help. And when you break it down and make it that simple, you lose all these details that are in some cases as much or maybe even more than the check going to anybody's bank account.
There's also a lack of sort of a historical memory. This is our recent sort of situation in terms of debt to GDP ratio. The only sort of analogous modern example we have this is in 1945, the conclusion of the Second World War. Mm-hmm. We were at that, we're now over 100% of debt to GDP. Yeah. And one of the ways that was handled in the past is we had, in the late 1940s, part of the way we got out of that debt was to inflate our way out. Mm-hmm. And inflation is an extremely regressive tax. Mm-hmm. It is a flat tax on money. Is one way you could think of it.
Well, it's a tax on savers.
It's a tax on savers.
And in favor of borrowers.
In favor of borrowers, which is another
in this case, dimension. The entire government, right?
And this also disproportionately affects people who don't have assets that would appreciate in value along with inflation. Mm-hmm. So those folks with, those folks who are savers.
Or don't own a home.
Don't own stocks, bonds, not bonds. Bonds are fixed rate. But any sort of assets, you're going to be hit harder by this. Now, national economic planning in general hasn't been, as a rule, a successful path to growth.
Right.
What we see sort of throughout the world is economic growth tends to trend with liberalization, with free trade, free and open markets, free, open, and competitive markets. You can spend your way to growth because, again, you push a third of the value of the American economy into the American economy over the period of 18 months. That's going to show up in those numbers. But that's not based on any sort of sustainable networks of specialization in trade. That's not based on actual needs and actual communities being satisfied by businesses that are actually responding to those needs. That's just
shifting money around.
Around.
You're not increasing production.
Yep. What is sort of I guess the one thing we didn't address is there was a very tiny sliver in these bills that was actually dedicated to sort of like vaccine restriction.
Yeah.
And the reason we've given that short shrift is it's just very little of these funds. Mm-hmm. Most of these funds are not.
Yeah, one would think COVID
response.
Relief. COVID-19 relief, that should be like item number one, right? Yeah. Getting treatment and prevention as widespread as we possibly can. But yeah, as you mentioned, it's a small sliver of any of these bills. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's something that is important, and I guess it's a merit of the bills, but it hardly explains the high dollar value going into any of these.
So do you think this is a new trend? That this is like the new bipartisan consensus, is that we consistently deficit spend, that we consistently try to shove money into people's pockets, that UBI was something that Andrew Yang ran on.
Yeah.
That we're looking for a future that's a much more sort of managed economy in the United States, where the government funnels money into particular industries and initiatives or into political cronies' pockets.
there are definitely people who think that that's what is needed. There are people who simply want that for other reasons. And frankly, there is a long history. I mean, look at corn or milk. There's a long history of, even in the United States, of the government doing that. But this is, as you noted, a much more massive scale. I don't know if this is the new normal or not. I mean, there were a lot of worries, I think, to some degree legitimate, but some of them not panned out over even just restrictions based on the pandemic. Oh, that once these things are taken away, they're never going to come back. Well, a few months ago, basically, now if you are fully vaccinated, you don't have to wear a mask wherever you go. Most, restaurants are able to open to, greater capacity. In Michigan, at least, which is one of the most restrictive, has been one of the most restrictive states. I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe it's July 1st.
Yes.
All people, vaccinated or not, don't have to wear masks. All restrictions are supposedly going to be done. So I think the reason for that, and vaccination rates are good. In Michigan in particular, but across the United States. So there is an actual fundamental reality they're responding to. But B, the restrictions were very unpopular. And I think they've proven to be the sort of thing that only had a limited political lifespan. And we even saw that initially. We had these very strict lockdowns, and then we shifted over to, it was stay home, save a life. If you're out in public, maybe we'll call the cops on you. There was, the proverbial Karen. My apologies to anyone named Karen, but that's what's kind of become synonymous with. But after 3 months, the line changed, and it was now wear a mask, save a life, right? Mm-hmm. And it never went back to stay home, save a life. I mean, some people still said, shouldn't be doing XYZ event or whatever, but we never went back. So the question for me is this actually economically sustainable? In the short term, maybe, especially if at some point we stop and things correct. But if we just keep doing this, there may come a point where the costs very palpably and obviously outweigh the benefits. And as soon as people start feeling that in their everyday life, it becomes politically disastrous. Now, unfortunately, the point at which that happens may be past the point of no return for recovering from potential damage. So I would hope that we all can be a bit more reflective about these sorts of policies rather than kind of the knee-jerk support of course I support American jobs and families and I care and I want COVID relief. Well, I want all those things too. And I think even there is a role for government relief to some degree, but in no way going to criticize anyone who said, hey, let's take a step back. Let's actually read through these bills rather than trying to push them through Congress. Let's see if we can maybe cut them down because a lot of this spending is not going to people who need it in any conceivable way. And then we have a question with, well, what do we do in our own lives? And I think you had some great questions along these lines as well.
Yeah. One of the hopeful things when you were talking about the sort of post-COVID normalization of life, which has been very encouraging, is that we're already starting to see signs from some governors, such as suspending the extended unemployment benefits. Mm-hmm. The Biden administration itself is receptive to ending those because they're seeing the effects on the labor market. So already some of these things, it seems like we're getting a consensus that people realize, these are really negative consequences, and we need to transition in some way to getting out of this 18 months of flooding the system with money. Now, there are a lot of people who are, as we were talking about sort of like personal responses, there are a lot of people who see this, who have the sort of concerns that we do, and they got checks.
Right. My wife and I, we got checks.
Yeah.
Or we got deposits.
I got deposits too. What do you do with that when you think these are sort of unsustainable economic policies?
Or at least that they're complicated. They're morally complicated.
Yeah.
Right. Not to mention economically complicated. Yeah, I think that's a great question is, what is the responsibility of people receiving these checks? As you mentioned, we talk all about the stimulus. What about the stimulated?
Yeah. What is the moral responsibility of the stimulated?
Right. And here I think – so let's take a worst case scenario. There are some who say, oh, this is just all bad morally, economically – so on and so forth. There's an interesting passage in the Gospels where Jesus is teaching his disciples about money. In fact, there's a lot about stewardship and money and economics and care for the poor, or economic ethics, I should say. There's not actually strict economics, but there's a lot of that just in the Gospels and throughout the Scriptures. And Jesus at one point says, he tells people to use unrighteous mammon, which is just money, to simplify, use unrighteous money to gain friends. And it's kind of a bizarre statement. Is Jesus telling you to take the dirty money, right? And to some degree, looking at some church fathers' interpretation of this passage, they kind of say yes. I mean, they're not saying, like, go ahead and make money by any means. And I don't think Jesus is saying that either. So good for everyone for reading that correctly. But they're saying, look, if you've come by resources in morally questionable ways, but now you want to be a good Christian, well, use them for good. Right? Don't just say, oh, this is all bad. Now I just, I need to squander it. It can't possibly use for good. Say, well, you've got these resources. Maybe you got them in a bad way, or maybe they came from a bad source. What good can you do with them? And I think that's a great starting place. One other thing that gets a little more particular, but I think it speaks to a concrete way of interpreting that is Clement of Alexandria. I know he points out that Jesus doesn't say give, right? He doesn't just say, oh, make sure you give away all this unrighteous mammon. Although he certainly tells some people they should give away all they have. But he says make a friend, and that's different. That requires a relationship. That requires a long intimacy. He says, and so I think the best place to start is to ask, well, what are my relationships? What people depend on me? I have kids. I have bills. That's what these relief checks were for. I don't think people should feel bad about spending them on that. It doesn't mean we should unquestionably say that they therefore are good. There's all kinds of complicated ways, as we've just gone over, that maybe they could have been better designed, better distributed, more targeted, more honed. Maybe we could cut out all the fat of a lot of this cronyism, whatever the case, central planning, all of that. Well, people are getting checks and people have needs. And it's totally okay to spend them on the people in your lives that depend on you and that you love and care about. So I think the Christian has to start there. Is you say, well, what good can I do with this? And that's going to look different for a lot of different people, just as I think we mentioned this on a previous podcast, but, Christ says to the one rich young man, sell all you have and give to the poor. And yet Zacchaeus, who gives away only half of what he has, he says, today salvation has come to this house. Why? Because different people have different callings and different places in life. And you have to look around yourself and you have to say, what are my relationships? Who are my friends? Who is my neighbor? And you start there.
One of the encouraging things I've seen is we've actually seen in these last 18 months household debt go down in the aggregate. So in a bizarre sense, in the way that the government is acting increasingly irresponsible and without any sort of thought of the future, individual households are. People are paying down debt. That is one of the things we've seen. One of the things I've seen, and I need to dig into more of this reporting, is because churches were disrupted
Absolutely.
by this pandemic. And there were a lot of dire predictions that we would see donations to churches collapse. Individual churches, I'm sure, are struggling, but I have heard of many congregations that have been sustained by their parishioners during these difficult times. That's also an excellent use of resources. Using these resources to acquire new skills, new opportunities for service, using these resources to support businesses, particularly businesses that have been disrupted by the pandemic, I think is also a commendable thing that people can do.
Right. Those businesses have people who have families who work for them from, the top all the way down to the bottom. Yeah. And if it's somewhere you regularly patronize, as much as economic exchanges are not the same as friendships, you still have relationships with the people, with the businesses, with the servers, the cooks, whatever sort of business it is. It might not simply be, just because on a balance sheet it looks like a simple exchange. In reality, all of this is complicated, right? Every person we meet is at least an opportunity for a relationship, and that includes our business transactions.
Dylan, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Dan.
I hope this is as a way that this can help our audience to think through and process not only the economic effects, but the moral implications for a lot of this policy. Because it really has touched each and every one of us in the last 18 months.
Absolutely.
And its legacy, at least the fiscal legacy, will be with us for a long time. Thanks again.
Thank you.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at actonline@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Gabriel Jaja.